I never thought my life would turn into a revenge story. Not at 73. Not after a lifetime of giving without asking for anything back. I believed that even if love faded, gratitude remained. I was wrong. If you had met me a week earlier, you would have seen nothing dramatic. Just an old man waking up before dawn out of habit, making coffee that's a little too strong, and sitting at the small kitchen table where my wife and I used to plan our week. The chair across from me has been empty for years now, but I still leave it pulled out, like she might walk in any second and tell me the coffee smells burnt again. I worked with my hands most of my life. Railroad mechanic. Grease under the nails, sore joints, and long nights fixing what other people broke during the day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Every paycheck had a destination: mortgage, groceries, and later, tuition. When my son was accepted to college, I remember holding the letter longer than I should have, like it might disappear if I blinked. People talk about sacrifice like it's something loud. Mine was quiet. Extra shifts. A truck sold when money got tight. New boots for him while mine kept splitting at the seams. I didn't complain. That's not what fathers do. We don't keep score. We just show up. After my wife passed, the house got quieter, but my son called every Sunday. Or at least he used to. Somewhere along the way, the calls got shorter, then less frequent. I told myself that was normal. Young men build lives. Fathers learn to step back. That morning, I was in the garage organizing tools I hadn't used in years when I heard his car pull into the driveway. I remember thinking it was odd. He usually texted first. When I opened the door, he stood there stiffly, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning past me like he was already late for something else. "Dad," he said, and for just a second, his voice almost sounded like it used to. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one, the same empty chair. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and placed an envelope in front of me. Thick, clean, white. The kind you use when you want to be taken seriously. "I need you to read this," he said. I asked him what it was. He shook his head and looked at the floor. "Just read it." I picked it up slowly, noticing how my hands felt heavier than usual. I didn't know then that this was the last quiet moment before everything I believed about fatherhood would be put on trial. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, no explanation. Just one sentence, printed neatly, like it had been rehearsed. "Dad, I'm not your son." I didn't speak. I didn't yell. I didn't even breathe for a moment. I just stared at the words, wondering how 40 years of scraped knuckles, missed sleep, and silent prayers could be erased with a single line of ink. And that was only the beginning. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the paper like it might rearrange itself if I gave it enough time. The words didn't blur. They didn't fade. They stayed exactly where they were. "Dad, I'm not your son." I'd read technical manuals my whole life. Blueprints, safety warnings, contracts written in language designed to protect everyone except the person reading it. But nothing had ever felt as precise or as cruel as that single sentence. I looked up at him. He was standing near the counter now, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That hurt more than the words themselves. "What does this mean?" I asked quietly. He swallowed. "It means things are complicated." Complicated. That was the word he chose, after reducing 40 years of fatherhood to a line on a piece of paper. I waited for him to say more, for an explanation, for anger, for guilt, for anything that sounded human. Instead, he shifted his weight and glanced toward the door, like he already had somewhere else to be. "You don't have to say anything right now," he added. "I just needed you to know." I remember thinking how strange that was, needed me to know, as if knowledge itself were a courtesy, as if handing your father a declaration like that was some kind of honesty. My chest felt tight, but not in the dramatic way people talk about. It was more like something had gone numb, like when your hand falls asleep and you're not sure whether the feeling will come back or not. I thought about asking the obvious question, about tests, about proof, about how a man comes to doubt something he'd never questioned for 3 decades. But the words stayed stuck in my throat. So I asked something else. "Why now?" That finally got a reaction. His jaw tightened. He hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. And in that hesitation, something clicked. Not loudly, just enough to shift the air in the room. "It's just timing," he said. "There's a lot going on." I nodded slowly. Timing. Another careful word. If you've ever been blindsided by someone you raised, someone you fed, clothed, protected, you probably know that moment. The one where you realize the truth you're being given isn't the whole truth. If you're watching this and something similar ever happened to you, you already understand why silence can be louder than shouting. I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. My hands were steady. I noticed that. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't yelling. I was just very aware of the space between us. He took that as permission to keep going. "I don't want this to turn into a big thing," he said. "I just want things to be clean." Clean. That word landed differently. Clean meant simple, controlled, presentable. Clean meant nothing messy, nothing emotional, nothing that didn't fit neatly into the life he was building. And standing there in my old kitchen, with my wife's chair still empty and my hands still smelling faintly of oil and dust, I understood something I hadn't wanted to see before. This wasn't about biology. This was about convenience. He didn't wait for my response. He thanked me for listening, said he had a meeting, and let himself out, like this was just another difficult conversation checked off his calendar. When the door closed, the house felt smaller, quieter. I sat there for a long time, envelope resting on the table between my hands, realizing that whatever this was, it wasn't the end. It was the first move. After he left, I stayed at the table longer than I needed to. The envelope sat there, like it was waiting for me to do something with it. Burn it, tear it up, hide it in a drawer. I didn't. I just kept looking at the crease down the middle of the paper, the one I hadn't noticed before. It struck me then that he'd folded it carefully. Not rushed, not angry. Careful. That detail wouldn't leave me alone. If you're truly convinced a man isn't your father, you don't handle the moment like that. You don't hesitate. You don't avoid eye contact. You don't stand in your childhood kitchen like you're bracing for impact. You say it and you're done. My son hadn't been done. Later that afternoon, I replayed the scene the way old men do, frame by frame. His hands, the way his fingers tightened around the envelope before letting go. The half-step backward he took after I read it, like he was preparing for something to fall apart. I realized then that he never once said the words test or proof. He didn't mention a result. He didn't talk about doctors or dates or timelines. For something that big, something that would rewrite both our lives, he'd been strangely light on details. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was angry, because my mind wouldn't stop working. By morning, I knew I needed to ask him one question. Just one. He came by again 2 days later, this time unannounced. I was in the yard, trimming back the hedges my wife used to fuss over. He watched me for a moment before speaking, like he wasn't sure whether to interrupt. "Dad," he said. I set the clippers down and wiped my hands on my jeans. "I need to ask you something," I said. He nodded, but his shoulders tensed. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Are you sure I'm not your father?" The pause that followed was brief, but it was there. A heartbeat too long. Long enough for the truth to show its outline. "I don't think it matters," he said finally. That was when I understood. It wasn't certainty that drove him. It was convenience. "Doesn't matter?" I repeated. He exhaled slowly, like he'd rehearsed this part. "There's a lot happening right now. My life is changing. I just need things to be simple." Simple. Again with that word. I watched his eyes flick past me, toward the house, the garage, the old tools leaning against the wall. The life he came from. The life he didn't want photographed. "So you don't know," I said. "You just don't want to know." He didn't deny it. That hurt more than the letter ever could have, because doubt can be resolved, tests can be taken, truth, even when it's ugly, can be faced. But a choice? A decision to erase someone because they don't fit the picture you're trying to sell to the world? That kind of wound doesn't heal the same way. "I didn't raise you to run from questions," I said quietly. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And for a moment, I saw the boy who used to wait by the window for me to get home from work. But the moment passed. "This isn't about running," he said. "It's about moving forward." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood what forward meant to him, and what it didn't include. As he walked away, I stood there in the yard, surrounded by things I'd built, fixed, and paid for with years of my life. And it became painfully clear that the letter hadn't been written to discover the truth. It had been written to make a clean break, without the mess of gratitude getting in the way. I thought the letter was the worst of it. I was wrong. 2 days after that conversation in the yard, my son called and asked if we could talk again. His tone was calm, almost professional, the way people sound when they've already decided how something is going to end, and just need to inform the other party. We met at my house. He didn't sit this time. He paced, stopping occasionally to look around, like he was seeing the place for the first time, and realizing it didn't fit into the future he'd imagined for himself. "I've been thinking about what you asked," he said. "About certainty." I waited. He took a breath. "I don't want to drag this out with tests and questions. It doesn't help anyone." There it was again, that wordless urgency to keep things neat, uncomplicated, manageable. "So you don't actually know," I said. "You just don't want to find out." He didn't argue. Instead, he shifted to something else, something he clearly felt more comfortable discussing. "There's a lot riding on this wedding," he continued. "It's important for my career, for the people I'm trying to build relationships with." I nodded slowly. I'd heard versions of this speech before, from men who were about to explain why something personal had to be sacrificed for something practical. "I need everything to look right," he said. "And some things from my past don't." He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not anger, not even surprise. Just a heavy, final understanding. "This isn't about whether I'm your father," I said. "It's about whether I embarrass you." He looked uncomfortable, which I suppose was his version of honesty. "It's not personal," he replied quickly. "It's just optics." Optics, a word people use when they want to distance themselves from the human cost of their decisions. He explained that the guest list was being kept tight, that the ceremony needed to reflect where he was headed, not where he came from, that certain people wouldn't understand our dynamic and might ask questions he didn't want to answer. "And where do I fit into this?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a second, long enough for the truth to slip through before he tried to dress it up. "It might be better if you weren't there," he said. "Not you don't belong. Not I don't want you. Just better if you weren't there." As if my absence were a practical improvement, like removing clutter from a room. I thought of all the times I'd stood in the background of his life already. School events, job milestones, moments where he'd said, "You don't need to come, Dad." And I'd told myself it was fine. This was different. "You're choosing to erase me," I said quietly. "Not because you know I'm not your father, but because it's easier." He didn't deny it. "I'm choosing what's best for my future," he said. That was the moment the last illusion fell away. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't fear. This was a decision, a calculated one. I realized then that the letter hadn't been about truth at all. It was about permission. Permission to move forward without carrying the weight of gratitude. Permission to pretend the man who'd raised him was optional. I stood there, in the house I'd paid for with years of my life, listening to my son explain why I no longer fit into the picture I'd helped him build. And for the first time since he handed me that envelope, I understood something clearly. He hadn't rejected me because I wasn't his father. He rejected me because I was. After he left, I didn't move right away. I stood in the living room, listening to the quiet settle back into the walls, the way it always did after a door closed. The house has learned how to be quiet. It's had years of practice. I walked into the kitchen and pulled out the old wooden chair my wife used to sit in. One leg still wobbles. I never fixed it because she liked to joke that it kept her alert. I sat there for a long time, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, letting memories come the way they always do, uninvited, but exact. I remembered the winter when the furnace died and money was tight. I wore 2 sweaters to work so I wouldn't have to turn the heat up at home. I remembered the night my truck wouldn't start and I walked 3 miles in the dark because overtime paid time and a half and tuition was due. I remembered cutting coupons at the table where I now sat, my wife circling prices in red pen, both of us pretending it was a game. None of those moments felt heroic at the time. They felt necessary. That's the part people forget. Sacrifice isn't dramatic when you're inside it. It's just the next right thing, done quietly, again and again. When my son was little, he used to fall asleep on the couch waiting for me to get home from late shifts. I'd carry him to bed, careful not to wake him, his small hand still clutching my shirt like he needed proof I was real. Later, when he got older, he stopped waiting up. That was fine. That's how it's supposed to go. What wasn't supposed to go was this. I walked into the garage and opened the metal cabinet where I keep papers I don't look at often. Old pay stubs, warranty manuals, a faded envelope with my wife's handwriting on it. Inside were notes we'd written to ourselves when things were hard, little reminders that what we were doing mattered. This is for him. One day he'll understand. I sat on the workbench and let the truth land where it needed to land. There is no receipt for raising a child. No ledger that lists the nights you stayed awake worrying, or the days you swallowed your pride so they wouldn't have to. There's no invoice for patience, or line item for love. You give those things away believing they become part of who your child is. What I was learning, slowly, painfully, was that some people don't see those things as gifts. They see them as obstacles, reminders of a past that doesn't match the future they want to sell. I thought about the envelope again, how clean it was, how final it sounded. And I understood something that hurt more than any accusation could have. My son hadn't forgotten what I did for him. He'd remembered it. And then he'd decided it wasn't worth keeping. By the next morning, the pain had shifted. It was still there, heavy and dull, but it had stopped moving. Pain settles when the truth finishes rearranging itself. I made coffee the way I always did and stood at the kitchen window, watching the street wake up. A man walked his dog. A delivery truck stopped 2 houses down. Ordinary life continued, unaware that something fundamental had changed inside me. That was when it finally became clear. My son hadn't acted out of confusion. He hadn't been misled, and he certainly hadn't been searching for the truth. What he'd done was deliberate, careful, measured. He had looked at his life like a balance sheet and decided that I belonged on the liability side. Once I saw it that way, everything else snapped into place. The language he'd used, the distance, the way he kept saying simple and clean. Those weren't words of a son in pain. They were the words of a man managing optics. He didn't see me as his father anymore. He saw me as a complication, a reminder of where he came from, of hands that worked instead of shook other hands, of a life built slowly, without shortcuts or polish. And in the world he was trying to enter, that kind of origin story didn't photograph well. That realization hurt, but it also did something else. It stripped away my confusion. For days I'd been asking myself what I'd done wrong, where I'd failed, whether I'd loved him too much or not enough. But standing there with my coffee cooling in my hand, I finally understood that this wasn't about my shortcomings. It was about his priorities. He wanted the benefits of having been raised well, the education, the stability, the discipline, without carrying the weight of acknowledging where those things came from. Gratitude didn't fit into the version of himself he was selling. And that was the hardest truth of all. My son wasn't rejecting me because he didn't know who I was. He was rejecting me because he did. I thought about all the men I'd worked with over the years, the ones who chased promotions and titles, and forgot who stood next to them when things were hard. Some of them ended up rich. Most of them ended up alone. I wasn't angry at my son in that moment. I was sad for him. Because once you decide that the people who built you are disposable, it becomes very easy for others to decide the same about you. I sat back down at the table and looked at my hands. Old hands, scarred hands, hands that had fed a family and fixed what needed fixing, without applause. Those hands had value, whether my son recognized it or not. And that was the turning point. I stopped asking why he'd done it. I started asking what I was willing to accept. Because love doesn't require you to erase yourself. And fatherhood doesn't mean tolerating disrespect just to stay connected. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for your child, is to refuse to participate in a lie. That afternoon, I made a quiet decision. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply decided that I would no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and so was mine. If you're still listening to this, I want to ask you something, quietly, honestly. Have you ever given years of your life to someone only to realize they were ready to set you aside once you stopped being convenient? If that question hit close to home, you're not alone.
And you're not wrong for feeling the way you do.
That night, I placed the envelope back inside the drawer where I keep things I don't want to look at every day. Not to forget it, but to remind myself that some wounds don't bleed. They wait. I didn't call my son. I didn't send a message. I let the silence stand where words no longer belonged. Because once a man decides to erase the debt of gratitude, no explanation can restore it. Only time or consequence can. I didn't know then what would come next. I only knew this wasn't over.